When contact between you and the avoidant finally ceases, when the texts stop arriving, when the calls end, when neither person reaches out to bridge the silence, a unique psychological process begins to unfold for both parties. This mutual silence is different from the avoidant's typical withdrawals, where you continue pursuing or waiting, hopefully, for their return. It's different from previous breakups, where one person fought to maintain connection while the other pulled away. This is the moment when both of you, for whatever reason, stop reaching across the distance. The avoidant stops sending breadcrumbs. You stop responding to them. The avoidant doesn't check in. You don't initiate contact. The relationship enters a state of complete communicative void, and within that void, powerful transformations occur. What happens next isn't predictable with certainty, because it depends on numerous variables: the depth of the original connection, the degree of work each person does during the silence, the circumstances that precipitated the mutual withdrawal, the attachment wounds each person carries. But certain patterns emerge with enough consistency that understanding them provides insight into what you're both experiencing during the silence, how those experiences differ, and what might ultimately emerge from this period of no contact. The initial relief that masks the deeper pain. The first response when contact stops for both you and the avoidant is often relief, though the nature and duration of that relief differs significantly between you. For the avoidant, the relief is immediate and pronounced. The pressure they've been feeling lifts. The expectations disappear. The obligation to respond, to show up, to maintain connection evaporates. They can breathe again without the weight of someone else's needs, hopes, and disappointments bearing down on them. This relief confirms what the avoidant has always believed: that distance equals safety, that separation brings peace, that their patterns of withdrawal are justified because they feel so much better when they're alone. The silence doesn't initially register as loss. It registers as liberation. The avoidant fills the space left by the relationship's end with activities that reinforce their independence. They focus on work with renewed intensity. They reconnect with friends they might have neglected during the relationship. They pursue hobbies and interests that don't require consideration of anyone else's schedule or preferences. They enjoy the autonomy of making decisions without consultation, of structuring their time without compromise, of existing without the constant awareness of someone else's emotional state. This period can feel genuinely good to the avoidant, like returning to themselves after a period of being stretched too thin by relationship demands. They tell themselves they're happier alone, that relationships aren't worth the discomfort, that they're better off without the complications that intimacy brings. For you, the initial relief is more complicated and shorter-lived. There's genuine relief in no longer expending energy trying to decode the avoidance behavior, no longer waiting anxiously for responses that may not come, no longer accommodating patterns that violated your needs. The constant emotional labor of managing the relationship ends, and that ending brings a kind of peace. You're no longer on the emotional roller coaster of the avoidance approach and withdrawal. You're no longer organizing your life around someone who couldn't consistently show up. The relief comes from recognizing that you've stopped participating in something that was damaging your well-being, that you've reclaimed your energy and attention, that you're no longer trapped in cycles that led nowhere. But beneath your relief lives grief that the avoidant doesn't initially experience. You're mourning what the relationship could have been, what you hoped it would become, the potential you saw in the avoidant that never fully materialized. You're grieving the moments of genuine connection that did exist, the vulnerability you shared, the intimacy you experienced during the warm phases. The avoidant tends to compartmentalize these positive memories, focusing on the relief of the relationship's end. You tend to hold both the relief and the grief simultaneously, which makes your experience more emotionally complex during this initial period. The relief for both of you also functions as a defense mechanism against the deeper pain that hasn't yet surfaced. For the avoidant, the relief prevents them from immediately confronting what they have lost and their role in losing it. For you, the relief provides temporary respite from the full weight of disappointment, betrayal, and loss that will emerge as the initial numbness wears off. Both of you are in a kind of emotional shock where the relationship's end hasn't fully registered in your nervous system. You're both still processing, still adjusting, still protected by the psychological buffers that prevent overwhelm. During this initial phase, the avoidant often experiences what feels like validation of their attachment style. They're alone and they feel fine, which confirms their belief that they don't really need intimate connection, that they're built differently from others, that their patterns of avoiding intimacy are simply part of who they are, rather than wounds that need healing. This false validation can last weeks or even months, depending on the avoidant's level of self-awareness and the depth of the connection that just ended. They're not yet feeling the loneliness that will eventually surface because they're still in the relief phase where autonomy feels like freedom rather than isolation. You, meanwhile, begin to experience waves of emotion that move beyond relief into anger, sadness, confusion, and regret. You might feel angry at the avoidant for their inability to show up consistently, angry at yourself for tolerating patterns that violated your needs, angry at the situation that two people who cared about each other couldn't make it work. You might feel profound sadness about the loss, about the ending, about the reality that love isn't enough without the capacity to sustain intimacy. You might feel confused about what went wrong, what you could have done differently, whether there was any version of events where the relationship could have succeeded, and you might feel regret about time invested, vulnerability shared, opportunities missed, while you were focused on someone incapable of meeting you halfway. The initial relief for both of you creates a false sense that the silence is sustainable, that you've both moved on, that the relationship is cleanly in the past. The avoidant believes they're fine because they feel fine in the present moment. You might believe you're healing because the constant anxiety of the relationship has ended. But the relief is temporary for both of you, a psychological holding pattern before deeper processes begin. The avoidant hasn't yet experienced the loneliness that emerges when the relief of autonomy wears off and the absence of connection becomes apparent. You haven't yet completed the grief process that will move you from relief through anger and sadness toward eventual acceptance and integration. The initial relief is real, but it's also a mask that covers the more substantial emotional work both of you will need to do as the silence extends and the reality of the ending settles into your respective psyches. The psychological shifts that occur in silence. As the silence between you and the avoidant extends beyond the initial relief phase, significant psychological shifts begin occurring for both of you, though these shifts follow different trajectories and timelines. The absence of contact creates a void that each of you feels differently, and within that filling process, transformation happens. For the avoidant, the silence eventually gives way to a creeping awareness that something is missing, that the relief of autonomy doesn't fully compensate for the absence of connection, that their life feels emptier than they expected it to. This awareness doesn't arrive as a sudden revelation. It seeps in gradually, through small moments when they want to share something with someone and realize you're no longer available, through evenings that feel longer and lonelier than they anticipated, through the recognition that the independence they fought for feels less like freedom and more like isolation. The avoidance psychological shift includes a reevaluation of the relationship now that the pressure of your presence has been removed. During the relationship, They focused primarily on what felt uncomfortable, your needs, your expectations, the obligations that intimacy created. But in silence, without those pressures, they begin to remember what was good. They recall moments of genuine connection, times when your presence enhanced their life rather than constricted it, experiences of being understood and accepted that they haven't found elsewhere. This selective memory is partly the avoidance tendency to idealize what's lost while devaluing what's present, but it also reflects genuine recognition of value they couldn't fully appreciate when they were focused on protecting their autonomy. The silence forces the avoidant to confront their patterns in ways they couldn't while you were still engaged with them. When you were pursuing, accommodating, or accepting breadcrumbs, the avoidant could maintain their belief that their patterns were reasonable responses to your behavior. But in your absence, when there's no one to blame for their loneliness, the avoidant must face the possibility that their own attachment wounds are creating the isolation they're experiencing. This confrontation with self isn't comfortable, and many avoidants resist it, preferring to stay in the relief phase or to quickly seek new connection that allows them to avoid examining their role in the relationship's failure. But for some avoidants, particularly those with enough self-awareness or those who felt genuine depth of connection with you, the silence becomes a catalyst for self-examination. The psychological shift for the avoidant also includes the eventual recognition that you're not waiting for them anymore, that the silence isn't temporary distance, but potentially permanent ending. This recognition often triggers the avoidant's own attachment anxiety in ways the relationship never did. When you are pursuing or available, the avoidant could take your presence for granted. But when the silence extends and they sense you've genuinely moved on, they experience the fear of abandonment that their distancing strategies have been designed to avoid. This fear can motivate the avoidant to break the silence, to reach out, to attempt reconnection. But the timing and nature of this reaching out reveals whether the avoidant has done genuine work or is simply responding to the discomfort of loss without addressing the patterns that created it. For you, the psychological shifts in silence follow a different path. Initially, you're processing grief, anger, and disappointment. But as time passes and the acute pain begins to subside, you start to gain perspective that was impossible during the relationship. You can see the patterns clearly now without the confusion of being inside them. You recognize how much you accommodated, how many times you accepted less than you deserved, how thoroughly you abandoned yourself trying to make the relationship work. This recognition can be painful, even shameful, but it's also liberating because it clarifies what you won't accept in future relationships. The silence allows you to reconnect with yourself in ways the relationship prevented. You rediscover interests and friendships that were neglected while your energy focused on managing the avoidance patterns. You rebuild your sense of self that may have eroded through constant accommodation. You restore your emotional equilibrium that was disrupted by the roller coaster of the avoidance approach and withdrawal. This reconnection with yourself is crucial healing work that can only happen in the avoidance absence, and it creates the foundation for whatever comes next. Whether that's eventual reconciliation from a position of strength or moving forward to healthier relationships. Your psychological shift includes developing clearer boundaries and standards for relationships. The experience with the avoidant, painful as it was, teaches you what you will and won't tolerate. You learn to recognize avoidant patterns earlier. You develop stronger commitment to your own needs. You build capacity to walk away from relationships that require you to shrink yourself or suppress your legitimate desires for connection. This learning doesn't erase the pain of the relationship's end, but it ensures the pain serves a purpose, transforming you in ways that protect you from repeating similar patterns. The silence also allows you to do the work of detaching emotionally from the avoidant. While they occupied central space in your emotional landscape during the relationship, The silence creates room for them to move to the periphery. You stop obsessively thinking about them. You stop checking for messages from them. You stop organizing your life around the possibility of their return. This detachment isn't about stopping caring. It's about releasing the intensity of focus that kept you trapped in hope and disappointment. The avoidant becomes someone you once knew, someone you cared about, someone who taught you important lessons, but no longer someone who determines your emotional state or life trajectory. The psychological shifts occurring in silence ultimately create divergence between you and the avoidant. You're moving toward greater self-awareness, stronger boundaries, and clearer sense of what you need from partnership. The avoidant may be moving towards similar growth, but they might also be cycling through their habitual patterns, seeking new connection that allows them to avoid examining themselves, or simply enjoying solitude while rationalizing that their attachment style is immutable. The silence reveals whether there's potential for genuine reconciliation based on mutual growth, or whether you're simply growing in different directions that make reunion impossible, regardless of residual feelings. The choice that determines the avoidant's ultimate destination. The avoidant stands at crossroads that determines the entire trajectory of their relational life, though many never consciously recognize this choice exists. This decision point arrives when the avoidant confronts clear evidence that their defensive patterns create consequences they can no longer ignore or rationalize. Perhaps they have lost someone they genuinely cared about. Perhaps they face their advancing age with awareness that their defended isolation has prevented them from building life that feels meaningful. Perhaps they observe others in fulfilling partnerships and recognize that their explanations for why relationship does not work for them ring increasingly hollow. Whatever catalyst creates the awareness, the avoidant faces fundamental choice: continue defending against vulnerability at all costs, or risk the terror of dismantling defenses that have protected them since early developmental experiences taught them that emotional openness leads to pain. This choice is not a single moment of decision, but rather a series of smaller choices that accumulate into life direction. Each time the avoidant feels the impulse toward intimacy and must choose between following that impulse or retreating into defended safety, they move incrementally toward one of their three possible destinations. Each time someone offers genuine care and the avoidant must decide whether to receive it or deflect it, they take step along path that leads either to continued isolation, to unsatisfying compliance-based partnership, or to the difficult work of transformation. The avoidant's ultimate destination emerges from thousands of these small choices about whether to risk vulnerability or maintain defended position. The choice toward continued isolation appears safest to the avoidant's defensive structure. This path requires no uncomfortable examination of wounds, no terrifying practice of vulnerability, no risk of the pain that emotional openness might create. The avoidant can maintain their familiar patterns, can continue organizing their life around defended independence, can preserve the illusion that their solitude reflects authentic preference rather than defended necessity. This choice allows the avoidant to avoid confronting that their defensive structure has been running their life, that their fear has been masquerading as preference, that their withdrawal has cost them access to experiences that give human existence meaning and depth. Yet this safe choice leads to destination characterized by increasing isolation and late life regret. The avoidant who chooses continued defense finds their world gradually constricting as opportunities for connection diminish with age. They face later years alone, supported by no one who knows them deeply, companioned by no one who has shared their journey, loved by no one who has been permitted past their walls. They recognize too late that the vulnerability they avoided to prevent pain has guaranteed different pain, the chronic ache of fundamental aloneness, the grief of life lived in defended isolation, the recognition that they have spent their existence running from intimacy, only to discover that what they ran toward feels emptier than what they fled. The choice toward compliant partnership offers different form of safety. This path allows the avoidant to achieve appearance of normal life, to have partner, to participate in coupled social activities, to avoid the stigma that solitude sometimes carries, while maintaining their defended emotional distance. The avoidant can point to their relationship status as evidence that they are capable of partnership while never risking the genuine vulnerability that authentic intimacy requires. They can have the form of relationship without its substance, the social validation of being partnered without the actual emotional engagement that makes partnership meaningful. Yet this choice leads to destination characterized by quiet desperation and contempt. The avoidant who settles for compliant partner discovers that having someone who accepts their limitations provides no satisfaction when that someone possesses none of the qualities that make relationship enriching. They experience chronic boredom in partnership with someone who has abandoned themselves to accommodate the avoidant's defended distance. They feel contempt for partner whose willingness to settle mirrors the avoidant's own self-abandonment. They recognize that they have achieved relationship while losing access to everything that makes relationship worthwhile. The challenge, the depth, the genuine meeting of two whole people, choosing each other from place of authentic desire rather than defensive necessity. The choice toward transformation represents the most difficult path because it requires the avoidant to face everything their defensive structure exists to prevent. This choice demands that the avoidant examine the wounds driving their patterns, sit with the vulnerability they have spent lifetime avoiding, practice new responses that feel foreign and terrifying. The avoidant must acknowledge that their defensive structure, while once necessary for psychological survival, now prevents them from accessing life's deepest satisfactions. They must recognize that the pain of transformation, while acute, is finite and leads toward expansion, while the pain of maintained defense is chronic and leads only to continued constriction. The avoidant who chooses transformation must tolerate feeling incompetent as they learn new relational skills. They must accept that growth involves mistakes, that developing vulnerability capacity requires practice that feels uncomfortable, that change happens gradually rather than through sudden insight. They must persist through moments when old patterns reassert themselves, when defensive withdrawal activates automatically, when the pull toward defended isolation feels overwhelming. They must trust that consistent effort gradually rewires the neural pathways established through decades of defensive practice, that small choices toward vulnerability accumulate into transformed relational capacity. Yet this difficult choice leads to destination characterized by genuine intimacy and relational fulfillment that the defended avoidant cannot access. The avoidant who does the work of transformation discovers that vulnerability, while uncomfortable, provides entry to experiences that make human existence meaningful. They experience the profound relief of being genuinely known by another person, of removing the mask they have worn throughout their defended life. They feel the warmth of reciprocal care, where both people support each other, rather than maintaining rigid self-reliance. They recognize the vitality that emerges when relationship involves genuine exchange between two whole people, rather than defended distance or one-sided compliance. The transformed avoidant builds partnership characterized by qualities they could not appreciate while defended: mutual respect, rooted in both people maintaining their autonomy while choosing connection; genuine intimacy emerging from reciprocal vulnerability rather than one-sided exposure; depth created through working through conflict rather than avoiding disagreement; security based on consistent presence rather than defended unpredictability. The avoidant discovers that the intimacy they feared does not destroy their autonomy, but rather enhances their experience of themselves and life. They recognize that genuine partnership with secure individual provides freedom within connection, rather than the suffocation their defensive structure predicted. The choice that determines the avoidant's destination ultimately comes down to which pain they are willing to accept. The acute pain of confronting their wounds and learning vulnerability, or the chronic pain of defended isolation or contempt-filled compliance. The avoidant who chooses the acute pain of transformation gains access to relational experiences that provide lasting satisfaction. The avoidant who chooses to avoid that acute pain through continued defense or settling for compliance guarantees themselves chronic suffering that extends across their remaining years. The difference between these destinations is profound, yet the choice often appears subtle in the moment, simply whether to lean slightly toward vulnerability or retreat slightly toward defense in any given interaction. Most avoidants never consciously make this choice, but rather default into one of these destinations through accumulated pattern of small decisions made without awareness. They arrive at solitude or unsatisfying compliance, not through deliberate selection, but through consistent choice of defensive safety over vulnerable risk. The rare avoidant who achieves transformation typically does so only after accumulated pain of their defensive patterns finally exceeds their fear of vulnerability, creating conditions where transformation becomes less terrifying than continued defense. The choice exists for all avoidants, yet only those willing to face their deepest fears access the destination where genuine intimacy becomes possible, rather than remaining forever theorized, but never experienced.